欢迎收看华尔街简报。可杀死70多种癌。美国研发治癌新药，不伤害正常细胞。美国最大癌症研究机构洛杉矶希望之城医疗中心宣布，他们日前成功研发出一颗名为 L1996 的小药丸，这颗药丸能够杀死多达70种实体癌症细胞、肿瘤，同时不伤害其他细胞，被认为是未来10年内治愈癌症的新希望。琳达·马洛卡斯教授和他的团队在历经长达20年的研究后，终于成功锁定 DNA 内一种特殊的蛋白质增殖细胞核抗原，简称 pcNNA， 以药物进行标靶破坏。马洛卡斯教授指出，目前已知 pcNNA 是 DNA 中负责复制、修补、染色质重塑和细胞周期调控的蛋白质，也就是负责控制癌细胞肿瘤的增长。他形容 pcNNA 就像是一个拥有多个登机口的航站大楼，但新研发的药物 L1996 就像一场暴风雪，可以直接让航站停摆，不允许仅载有癌细胞的班机起飞。L1996 通过影响 pcNNA 破坏癌细胞的正常繁殖周期，阻止 DNA 受损的细胞分裂，以及阻止有缺陷的 DNA 复制，来从根本杀死癌细胞。不只可以抑制肿瘤生长，或与其他癌症治疗结合使用，更重要的是不会产生毒性。目前已在实验室中对70多种不同的癌细胞，包括来自乳腺癌、前列腺癌、脑癌、卵巢癌、宫颈癌、皮肤癌和肺癌的癌细胞进行了测试，发现对所有癌细胞均有效。而药物名称 L1996 的由来是为了纪念一名因神经母细胞瘤过世的小女孩安娜·奥利维亚西利。马洛卡斯教授表示，当年他在实习时遇到安娜的爸爸，对方得知他正在研究乳腺癌，当下立即给他一笔实验经费，希望他能够多研究一点神经母细胞瘤。马洛卡斯教授说，我知道，我想为那个小女孩做一些特别的事情。目前 L1996 才要进行预计为期至少2年的一期临床实验，首名参与测试的病患才于去年10月服用了药物，该药物仍需经过严格的安全性和有效性测试以及大规模临床试验后才能广泛投入临床治疗中，但科学家仍乐观地认为，此药物能在10年内治愈癌症。希望之城医疗中心创建于1913年，是美国最大的非营利癌症研究机构之一，也是美国西岸排名第1的癌症治疗医院，拥有逾300项研究专利，其中包括人工合成胰岛素、人工合成生长激素等创世纪的医学里程，更研发出多款现广为使用的抗癌药物，如贺癌平、乳癌药物、标靶药物阿瓦斯汀等。去年更砸下3.9亿元，并购美国癌症治疗中心，其据点横跨美国4州。每年可为大约11万5千名患者提供治疗服务。居民消费拉得动疲软的中国经济吗？德国之声中文网。中国政府接二连三地发布惨淡的经济数据，也接二连三出台提振措施，促进消费更是其中的重点。常年关注中国经济的欧洲经济学家认为，这些措施普遍治标不治本，但真正有用的措施则需要花很多钱，且必须假以时日方能见成效。根据国家统计局的最新数据，7月份的中国制造业采购经理人指数为 49.3， 仍然低于枯荣线50，仅略好于6月份的 49.0。 统计局指出，外部环境复杂严峻，需求低迷是中国制造业面临的主要挑战。直接反映国内市场需求的消费价格指数更是在今年6月环比下滑 0.2%， 仅与疫情肆虐的去年同期持平。面对惨淡的数据，中国政府近日接连出台一系列经济提振措施。就在本周，中国财政部出台措施，对小微企业以及个体工商户提供进一步税收优惠。工信部、银监会、证监会、央行同期也宣布为中小企业融资提供便利。本周早些时候，国务院发改委还出台20条措施，从而在后疫情时代恢复和扩大消费，其中扩大电动汽车消费、扩大保证性租赁房供给是重点。常年研究中国经济问题的基尔大学世界经济研究所的专家朗哈默教授认为，北京方面出台的这些措施大多只是头痛医头，脚痛医脚，治标不治本。他在接受德国之声采访时说，这就像黑夜里划亮一根火柴，而火柴的燃烧速度是很快的，熄灭的也很快。朗哈默指出，中国政府现在无法保证具有可持续的经济提振措施得以实施，因为后疫情时代的关键症结是人们对中国经济缺乏信心。而造成这一现象的原因，则包括青年失业率高涨、民众对工资收入的预期走低等等。发改委副主任李春玲在7月31日的新闻发布会上也承认，一些居民的消费信心不强，顾虑不少，需要政策进一步加力。苏黎世联邦理工大学瑞士经济研究所的学者艾辛瑙尔在接受德国之声采访时同样指出， 房地产市场的低迷、高企的青年失业率一方面让消费者信心不足，另一方面也导致许多民众手头确实没有多余的闲钱进行消费，而且种种因素正导致中国面临通货紧缩的危险。虽然说物价下跌对消费者是一个利好，但是消费者也会产生一个过段时间再买会更便宜的心理预期，这也可能对眼下的消费市场产生不利影响。艾辛瑙尔也认为，与中国经济眼下面临的巨大问题相比，北京方面近期连续出台的一系列措施规模似乎太小。他说，中国政府显然是意识到了公共财政负债率居高不下的问题，尤其是地方政府的债务负担极其沉重，而出台更大规模的经济提振措施则需要花更多的钱。他认为，如果中国政府真的想要提振消费者信心，就必须在减轻居民养老负担、降低青年失业率方面入手，而非治标不治本地试图给汽车消费、电子产品消费提供优惠。这位关注中国经济的瑞士学者还指出，北京前些年重拳打击科技行业、教培行业，其负面影响之一就是如今居高不下的青年失业率，这些行业曾经吸引了许多青年人就业。所以，中国政府如果能够重新让这些行业自由化，也许会比现在花钱局部促进消费的措施取得更大的效果。中国经济的传统增长引擎包括内部消费、投资拉动、出口贸易。在艾辛瑙尔看来，这三台引擎如今都出现了问题，全球其他国家的经济也处在疲软周期，一些西方国家一方面担心衰退，一方面又不得不加息来对抗通货膨胀问题，这就导致对中国产品的需求减低。中国外贸面临的另一个不利因素则是地缘战略形势紧张，中国与美国、西方的关系走向充满了不确定性。美国限制某些产品向中国出口，许多市场人士担心中国将无法继续生产某些产品，所以这又导致了投资者信心不足。如何标本兼治？艾辛瑙尔认为，面对如此多挑战的中国政府，能够采取的有效措施其实并不多。经济主管部门固然可以运用降息、降准等货币政策手段让银行向企业增发贷款，也可以自己举债大规模投资基建，但考虑到本就高涨的债务水平，北京在货币政策、基建投资方面的回旋空间并不多。这位经济学家最为推崇的还是减少对企业的限制，加强市场自由化，从而让企业获得新的业务机遇，就业市场也会因此获得新的动能。基尔大学的经济学家朗哈默则相信，要想让内部消费需求来提振中国经济，北京必须真正投资社会保障事业，从而让千千万万的家庭免于后顾之忧，有信心敢于花钱。这绝非一朝一夕能够实现，而是一个漫长的过程。但中国必须走这条道路，否则消费在经济中的占比就始终偏低，中国也就永远无法转型为内需拉动、服务业为主的经济强国。习近平不会被拜登在气候问题上施压，但达成协议是可能的。国会山报，美国气候特使约翰·克里和中国对应人谢振华最近的会晤是两个最大温室气体排放国之间接触的一个积极步骤。会谈重点讨论了能源转型、甲烷排放和长期气候目标等关键问题。中美双边气候热线的重新建立和承诺，在未来7个月内提供一个共同的产品，是中国愿意重新参与气候问题的迹象。这些会谈还凸显了两国在快速发展的绿色经济方面的共同利益。然而，双方都需要避免一些陷阱，不应过高期望，因为这次访问只是进一步讨论的起点。同样重要的是要认识到，中国在气候目标上不容易被推动。美国国内政治，特别是缺乏两党支持气候行动的情况，也在中国的犹豫中起到了作用。此外，有一种悲观主义和对外交价值的否定的危险。美中气候谈判永远不会毫无痛苦，但持续的接触是必要的，因为气候变化是两国无法分离的领域。在2021年取得的进展表明了接触的价值，尽管美中关系存在挑战。最后，需要一众创新和激励人心的方法来解决气候问题。竞争可以激励国内行动，但政治化的竞争框架可能会增加不必要的敌对情绪。重点应该放在互相交谈的基本行为上。总的来说，如果两国在气候谈判中以清醒的态度接近，并避免过去阻碍进展的陷阱，进展是可能的。意大利对中国的一带一路计划后悔不已。国会山报，意大利在2019年加入中国的一带一路倡议的决定受到了该国国防部长吉多·克罗瑟托的批评，他称之为临时和可怕的。意大利政府原本希望加入这一倡议能增加对中国的出口，但相反，中国在3年内将对意大利的出口增加了3倍。意大利参与 BRI 引起了中国和欧盟的担忧。 中国警告意大利可能退出该倡议的负面影响，而欧盟则将 BRI 视为对国际秩序的挑战。欧盟回应这一情况的方式是创建自己的倡议，名为全球门户，旨在与全球南方国家合作，并在各种项目上投资3000亿欧元、3500亿美元。虽然欧盟的资金远远小于中国在 BRI 上的投资，但它表明欧盟认识到仅靠言辞无法对抗 BRI。中国经济的困境以及欧盟对气候问题的关注为全球门户提供了成为 BRI 可信替代方案的机会。意大利将在12月份决定是否继续参与 BRI， 而欧洲对中国的日益担忧以及欧盟自己的倡议表明意大利可能选择退出。如果其他 BRI 参与国效仿意大利的做法，可能会削弱中国10年前推出的旗舰项目。中国谴责意大利对“一带一路”的恶意批评。德国之声。中国指责意大利政府内部的某些势力将“一带一路”倡议政治化，称他们最近对 BRI 的批评是企图破坏合作。中国外交部警告称，这种恶意炒作违背了历史潮流，将伤害他人而不利于自己。这番批评是在意大利国防部长吉多·克罗瑟托将意大利加入 BRI 的决定称为临时和可怕的行为之后发表的。意大利在2019年成为唯一一个加入 BRI 的 G7 国家，签署了价值28亿美元的29项协议。然而，意大利在2024年 BRI 协议到期时不太可能续签。意大利总理乔治亚·梅洛尼表示，可以与北京保持良好关系，而不必成为该协议的一部分。意大利的退出将对 BRI 造成打击，因为接受国家因基础设施项目相关的无法偿还债务而陷入困境。BRI 已经被缩减。BRI 的批评者认为，它是北京增加地缘政治和经济影响力的工具，同时让低收入国家背负无法应付的债务。中国确保乌克兰和平谈判不会变成反俄罗斯局面。南华早报。根据分析师的说法，中国可能会努力防止沙特举办的有关乌克兰和平计划的会议成为一个反俄罗斯的事件。据报道，这个为期2天的会议邀请了30多个国家，乌克兰预计寻求更多国际支持。最近退出保护乌克兰谷物出口协议的俄罗斯并未受邀。中国与金砖国家合作伙伴印度、巴西和南非一起受邀参加这次会议。专家们认为，中国的参与旨在寻求和平解决方案，防止这次会议变成孤立俄罗斯的场合。中国已将自己定位为俄罗斯和乌克兰之间的潜在调解者，并希望利用这次峰会推进自己的和平计划。主办这次会议的沙特阿拉伯不太可能将其变成反俄罗斯的场合，因为它与俄罗斯和中国都有密切的关系。当谈到核武器的建设时，中国寻求的是质量而非数量。南华早报。根据中国国防分析师的说法，中国正在专注于其核弹头的质量而非数量。这是对日本国防部白皮书的回应。该白皮书暗示中国到2035年可能将其核武库增加到1500枚核弹头。北京方面已经投入大量资源提升其核威慑能力，包括精确打击技术和破坏性能力。中国承诺维持其不首先使用政策，其现有核弹头已足以打击美国西南部90%的主要国防工业中心。分析师们认为，中国的战略与西方和大国不同，它更注重质量而非数量。习近平主席在未来5年内设定了建立强大的战略威慑体系的目标，这表明中国将升级其核武库和技术。然而，专家们认为中国的核发展不会像美国和俄罗斯那样大幅增加核弹头数量。相反，人们关注的是中国是否会发展低当量核武器以对抗美国。预计美国在未来10年将花费6340亿美元升级其核武库，包括开发新的低当量核弹头。五角大厦曾暗示中国可能将 DF-26 中程弹道导弹作为战术核武器的平台，但分析师们强调，中国只有在受到先发制人攻击时才会这样做。中国将继续专注于提升其洲际弹道导弹技术，而非低当量核弹。中国对 iPhone 的强劲需求成为苹果在疲软中一个亮点。南华早报。根据苹果公司的数据，2022年第2季度，苹果在中国的销售额同比增长了 8%， 达到158亿美元。苹果首席执行官蒂姆·库克表示，在中国，我们实现了加速增长，并补充说该市场在6月季度创下了历史新高。该公司整体营收则下降了 1%。库克表示，中国市场有大量用户从安卓转换到 iPhone 手机。结果还显示，苹果在中国大陆的 iPhone 销量同比增长了 6.1%。谢谢大家收看华尔街简报。更多及时的新闻，请看六度世界3w.6do.world。
中国公安部涉及户籍、签证等26项措施8月底前全部实施。 中国网8月3日讯，记者张燕林，公安部研究室副主任何文林在公安部3日举行的新闻发布会上介绍，公安部将实施公安机关服务保障高质量发展26项措施，涉及加大制度供给、优化管理服务、提升安全水平等方面，旨在更好服务保障高质量发展。何文林表示，公安部将对这些措施逐一细化方案，落实责任，强化督查，力争8月底前全部部署实施，确保取得实效，让人民群众看得见、摸得着，有实实在在的获得感。公安机关服务保障高质量发展若干措施。1、全面实施行政许可事项清单管理，对清单内的公安行政许可事项逐项明确许可条件、申请材料、审批程序、审批时限，并向社会公布，加快实现同一事项在不同地区和层级同要素管理、同标准办理，激发各类市场主体创新创业活力。2、大力推进以人为核心的新型城镇化，健全以常住地登记户口制度，进一步放宽落户条件，降低落户门槛，促进有能力在城镇稳定就业和生活的农业转移人口举家进城落户。调整优化超大、特大城市落户政策，完善积分落户制度，更好地解决进城普通劳动者的落户问题。进一步放宽集体户设立条件，鼓励有条件的地方取消人才市场、众创空间等单位设立集体户限制，推行乡镇、街道或村、社区设立公共集体户，便利各类人员落户。3、探索户籍准入同城化，支持具备条件的都市圈或城市群探索实行户籍准入年限同城化累计互认、居住证互通互认。4、试点实施灵活落户政策，对农村籍大学生、科技人才、退伍军人因实际居住、就业创业等申请落户的，可以迁入原籍地或就业创业地，助力城乡融合发展。5、为外籍商贸人员来华办理口岸签证，并提供换发多次签证便利。对来华商务洽谈、商贸交流、安装维修、参展参会、投资创业等的外国人，来不及在境外办理来华签证的，可凭企业邀请函件和证明材料申请办理口岸签证入境。因商贸业务需要多次往返的，入境后可以换发3年内多次入境有效商贸签证。6、外国人申办居留证件免于留存护照。外国人申请办理居留许可，在按规定核验本人有效护照后，可不留存护照原件，方便外国人在此期间持护照办理有关事项。7、试点下放保安服务公司设立和保安员证核发审批权限，将保安服务公司设立由省级公安机关下放至社区的市级公安机关审批，将保安员证核发由社区的市级公安机关下放至县级公安机关核发，推行保安员考试网上报名、预约、审核制度。8、探索旅馆业一业一证改革，支持地方探索整合旅馆业审批要件，实行一次告知、一表申请、一窗受理、一网通办、一同核查、一并审批、一证准营。9、方便农村群众申办交管牌证，推进小型汽车登记和驾驶证考试业务下放至县级公安机关，试点将中型以上载客汽车登记业务下放至具备条件的县级公安机关。优化摩托车科目1考试内容，改进摩托车考试组织方式，为农村群众提供就近便捷交管服务。10、提高道路资源利用率，推广路口交通精细化组织方式，持续优化交通信号配时，在交通流潮汐特点明显的道路设置潮汐车道，探索设置多成员车道。因地制宜，在学校、医院门口设置限时停车位，支持鼓励住宅小区和机构停车位错时共享。进一步推广轻微交通事故视频快触。11、便利交通物流货运车辆通行，进一步放宽城市道路对新能源厢式和封闭式货车的通行限制，推广城市货车通道，保障货车顺畅进出近现行区域内的物流园区、工业园区，监测路网交通运行态势，强化区域间协同配合，建立健全疏导分流保障机制，及时处置交通事故等突发情况。12、进一步促进汽车消费，实施国产新能源小客车及国产其他小客车新车上牌前，生产企业提前查验，车辆管理所免予查验制度，进一步简化二手车异地交易登记和二手车出口登记手续，积极配合推动建立安全可循环的车辆固废回收体系，大力支持新能源充电桩及配套停车位建设。13、实行公安政务服务一窗通办，推行户政、治安、交管、出入境审批管理事项一窗受理综合服务，逐步实现群众一个窗口办成所有事。14、持续推进公安政务服务全程网办。 试点新生儿入户，居民身份证丢失补领，领证不超过2年，居住证办理、户籍类证明开具等高频事项全程网办，推动更多服务事项由网上可办向全程网办、好办易办转变。15、全面实施跨省通办。对户口迁移、首次申领居民身份证、申领临时居民身份证、户籍类证明开具、无犯罪记录证明开具等事项，全面实施跨省通办。16、实施免交证办城市改革。按照能减则减、能免则免的原则，加快实现群众办事办照免交居民户口簿、居民身份证、居住证、户口准签证、户口迁移证、驾驶证、护照等证照材料。17、试点证件照片一拍共享，一照通用。研究制定证件照片统一采集标准，推进共享应用，解决群众证件照片多次、多头采集问题。18、大力推进公安政务服务进社区、进农村。加强派出所综合服务窗口、警务室建设，方便群众就近就地办理相关事项。19、为船舶和人员出海报备提供便利。上线平安出海微信小程序，将出海船舶和出海人员纸上报备改为手机移动报备。20、精准对接产业安全发展需求，进一步拓展警企沟通联系渠道，推行主动警务、预防警务，鼓励有条件的地方根据产业发展需要建设线上线下警务服务站点，提供便利服务和安全保障。21、保障服务新业态、新模式规范有序发展。对新业态、新模式坚持监管规范和促进发展并重，促进共享经济、网约房、民宿、电竞酒店、剧本娱乐经营场所、智能网联汽车等新经济健康发展。22、以区域警务协同服务区域协调发展，持续推进京津冀、长三角、粤港澳大湾区等区域内治安、户政、交管、出入境等服务事项跨省通办、互通互认，推进区域安全风险共防、隐患共治，以及长江大保护、黄河流域生态保护等协同监管执法。23、全面推行双随机、一公开监管，将旅馆业、公章刻制业、废旧金属收购业、保安从业单位和保安培训单位纳入双随机、一公开检查范围，充分运用行政、法律、经济、信用等监管手段，创新监管方式，实现规范有效监管。24、加强重点行业、重点领域安全监管，进一步健全完善枪支弹药、爆炸物品、危险化学品、易制毒化学品安全监管制度机制，大力推进源头监管、科学监管、精准监管，提升安全监管效能。25、完善重点车辆及驾驶人道路交通安全监管，建立危化品运输部门协同联动监管平台机制，健全交通安全风险评估制度，深化危险化学品运输电子运单、车辆动态监控系统应用，推动加强全过程闭环安全监管，全面排查消除重点车辆、重点企业、重点路段安全隐患，集中整治重点交通违法行为。26、依法保护企业产权和经营者合法权益，依法严厉打击欺行霸市、网络传销、走私、非法经营、侵犯知识产权和制售伪劣商品等犯罪活动，维护公平竞争的市场秩序，严厉打击侵害企业产权和经营者合法权益的各类违法犯罪活动，坚持追赃挽损与侦查破案并重，最大限度减少企业损失，进一步规范涉企执法行为，加强对接报案立案、强制措施适用、异地办案协作、查扣动等环节的执法监督，完善核查督办等机制。
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这期的热点深度继续关注巨前生。巨前生凶多吉少。香港《明报》在8月3日的一篇文章《解放军整肃未完，外交部祸不单行》中提到，解放军战略支援部队的司令巨前生上将缺席了庆祝中国人民解放军建军96周年的国防部招待会。文章称，月前就传出巨前生正接受调查，现在他又接连缺席多个重要场合，看来是凶多吉少。此外，该文还提到，战略支援部队的高层去年以来却连番出事，现是航天系统部的司令尚红中将在当选中共20大代表之后，却未能通过代表的资格审查，是全国被取消资格的多名代表之一，或已悄然去职。在2022年的9月底，《青岛日报》有一篇文章就提到，中共20大代表名单是正式公布，共有2296名，而此前官方宣布20大代表名额为2300名。消失的这4名党代表应该是原甘肃省委秘书长周伟、原浙江嘉兴市委书记张斌，以及黑龙江基层女代表高金超，还有这个解放军中将尚红。尚红出生于1960年， 山东青岛人，19大代表，中央委员，1982年上洪自太原机械学院，就是中北大学的前身，自动控制系自动化专业毕业，曾任中国人民解放军总装备部司令部参谋长，中国酒泉卫星发射中心的主任。2016年任中国人民解放军战略支援部队的副司令员，中国人民解放军战略支援部队航天系统部的司令员。2017年上洪晋升中将的军衔。在2022年，上洪起初当选20大代表，但未出现在最终名单中。到2023年年初引发中美关系风波的这个气象气球或者气象飞艇，据说也与战略支援部队有关，而最高层事前并不知情，直到美方抗议才知道最高层也是颇为恼火。再回头关注战略支援部队的司令巨乾生，在2021年7月，巨乾生获得晋升为上将。媒体财新对比了当时同样获得晋升的王秀斌、徐启林、刘振立，发现巨乾生的原任职、出生年月、籍贯、晋升、中将时间备注这几栏都是空白。财新称这几名新晋升的上将中，新任的这个战略支援部队司令员巨乾生的公开资料极少。也有别的中国媒体说巨乾生出生于1962年的5月，其于2015年晋升少将军衔，2019年晋升中将军衔，曾任总参谋部技术侦察部的副部长。在2018年任中国人民解放军战略支援部队网络系统的部的司令员。一位中国人士观察者向华尔街电视频道透露说，巨乾生这个巨的姓氏非常罕见，这个姓有人说从姬姓而来，而解放军总参二部曾经的这个部长姬胜德也是中共元老姬鹏飞的儿子，曾被卷入了美国的选举舞弊案。在1992年至2000年间，克林顿是担任美国的总统，而在1996年的连任竞选前，有一笔来自中国竞选经费被打给了当时的民主党筹款人钟玉汉，用以支持克林顿参选，而这笔30万美元资金的真正主人竟是时任解放军总参情报部也是总参二部的常务副部长姬胜德。1999年3月，姬胜德少将被免除了职务，隔离进行审查，因为他的老父亲是开国元勋姬鹏飞。姬胜德是希望凭借家族的背景来大事化小，长期保持一言不发的态度。不过姬鹏飞也是他的父亲在2000年初去世，有说法说他的父亲是自我了断。姬胜德以受贿罪，随后和贪污罪以及挪用公款罪等多项罪名之理由被拘捕。解放军军事法庭在一审中判处其死刑，缓期2年执行。姬胜德在上诉之后，高层认为他在后期主动交代问题，积极退还赃款，并主动揭发其他人的违法乱纪行为，有立功的表现。在2002年终审判决将姬的刑罚由死缓改为了无期徒刑。由于姬胜德患有严重的心脏病，法院是准许他保外就医。姬胜德随后被送到京郊一军队医院治疗。那后来呢？总参二部的另外一个部长杨辉在2018年的8月因涉嫌严重违纪接受了军纪委的调查。情报系统出事的人如此之多，是因为组织里太黑暗，很多活动很多经费都是隐秘的，都容易出问题。安全部是这样，公安部是这样，军方也是这样。而关于解放军的这个战略支援部队，智库布鲁金斯学会在2022年的12月有一篇文章分析了解放军战略支援部队在 AI 人工智能创新浪潮下的趋势。文章就提到2015年中国对军队进行了实质性的改革，其部分动机是将解放军的能力从专注于陆基领土防御转移到以确保中国在太空、网络空间和远海的战略利益为目的的延伸力量投射。这些改革的一个关键因素是成立了这个战略空军，集中执行这些广泛领域的任务。那战略航空部队的任务是整合以前分散在解放军各部门的众多战略职能和能力，包括太空、网络空间、信息战和心理战。那如今这个战略支援部队由覆盖这些职能的2个部门组成，空间系统部以及网络系统部，或者说航空系统部和网络系统部。前者负责所有与空间有关的任务，那后者则负责广义上的解放军信息战的活动。战略支援部队的总体目标是获取信息优势，以促进决策优势，进而取得胜利。分析家们最近是得出结论，认为战略信息部队的任务很可能是支持对信息优势的追求，可以分为2类，一是直接向解放军 最高领导层提供战略信息优势和支持能力，包括反太空作战和进攻性的网络战，以及向战区军事指挥部提供信息支持服务。战略信息框架的部分目的似乎还在于提高解放军的整体联合性及实施联合作战的能力。从历史上来看，由于解放军在创新以及情报监视和侦察能力方面举步维艰，因此在一体化的联合作战方面一直是面临着巨大挑战。由于战略支援部队提供的信息支持可能包括情报、监视和侦察，以实现作战和战略的目标。有一些专家推测，战略支援部队在提高解放军整体联合度方面发挥着关键作用。为了完成既定任务，战略支援部队似乎还拥有多个开发或获取技术的机制。尽管国家安全部队并不是解放军中唯一履行这一职能的机构，但有证据表明，国家安全部队负责的与人工智能相关的设备合同比解放军任何其他部门都要多。更具体地说，战略支援部队在人工智能创新方面进行了大量投资，利用公司合作伙伴关系获得了情报、监视和侦察，还有自动驾驶车辆、信息和电子战、模拟和训练、预测性维护和目标识别方面的等等新技术。美国国家安全人工智能委员会在去年的最终报告中得出结论说，尽管人工智能将在所有领域无处不在，但在与太空网络和信息作战领域相关的高数据量使这些领域的用力特别适合在战争游戏、战争推演、演习和实验中优先集成人工智能应用。这些正是战略支援部队的工作领域。战略支援部队的许多职能涉及以超出人类能力的速度处理多样化、高容量和快速变化的信息流，这些都是应用人工智能的绝佳候选对象。例如，人工智能可以通过收集、组合和分析信息，帮助创建和维持态势感知，或许还能用于预测。此外，人工智能还有助于分析潜在行动方案的后果，以及进行规划和战争博弈。不过，指挥决策由战区军事指挥部或联合参谋部完成，同时用于决策支持应用的人工智能的实际开发可能是由中国人民解放军的其他部门完成，如中国国防科技大学以及其军事科学院，而不是由战略支援部队来完成。不过，在为这些决策者提供信息的支持时，战略支援部队很可能会在与这些人工智能系统的接口方面发挥重要作用，进而为决策提供支持。同时在中国正在开发的有12项人工智能主要军事应用中，至少有5项与战略支援部队的任务密不可分。这包括智能卫星、情报监视和侦察、软件、自动网络攻击软件、认知电子软件以及可能的自动驾驶汽车。按领域来分类的话，有这么几种可能是这个战略支援部队的重中之重。第一个就是太空上面的业务。而在太空业务方面，报告给出的结论是，中国很可能正在探索使用人工智能，包括管理大型卫星以及分析地球观测数据及认知无线电。这种智能无线电旨在是通过自主转换信道来避免干扰以及堵塞，从而提高天基通信的效率。自主卫星操作以弥补有限的通信窗口和带宽以较长的延迟，以及减少地面卫星操作员的工作量。而在网络方面，在网络领域或网络系统局中，网络安全和电子战都依赖于大量数据进行实时分类，以识别威胁和更新防御。比如，人工智能引导的敌方网络导航可以为基础侦察和网络攻击提供信息，这一任务属于战略支援部队的职责范围。而该部队的成立在一定程度上是为了巩固中国网络安全与电子战之间可能存在的联系。自动化还能提高网络防御的速度和规模，减轻解放军以前面临的限制。另外一方面还有电子战，人工智能有助于电子战，比如提高电子战系统的自主性或识别雷达或通讯系统发出的信号并对其进行分类，检测干扰器并对其进行分类，改进干扰信号到达方向估计，开发高效的反干扰协议，以及实时更新防御系统。尽管目前可以确定人工智能在战略支援部队任务集中的许多应用，但其最重要的长期影响可能是较难预测。此外，中国白皮书中正确确定的人工智能计划并不一定与人工智能创新的实际进展相关联。事实上，中国在人工智能领域的大量投资似乎也是商业性的，而且很可能与军事任务关系不大。根据这份报告评估的观点，及之前对中国目前人工智能能力的估计很可能也被夸大。这意味着人们是不可能看到人工智能会立即融入解放军的任务领域， 而且当人工智能系统被采用时，它们可能会很脆弱、不安全或不可靠。那这份报告的结论是，战略支援部队的任务确实是获取信息优势，以实现决策优势，进而取得胜利。而就人工智能而言，这意味着战略支援部队必然会采用和整合人工智能应用，以弥补解放军先前在确保和利用信息优势方面的不足。但这并不意味着战略支援部队将成为解放军整体人工智能创新的协调中心。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注六度简报网站，网址是6度brief.com。在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
I'm Dan Kurtzpfahlen, and this is the Foreign Affairs Interview.
If Xi Jinping cashiers his closest friend, what does he get for that from the U.S.? The entire U.S. full-court press remains in place. There's no reciprocation for any potential abandonment of Putin.
That's Stephen Kotkin, the great Russia scholar and Stalin biographer. I sat down with him and the great China scholar Orville Schell for a conversation about Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, what binds them together, what kind of world they want, what their partnership means for U.S. foreign policy. We taped our interview on June 16th and covered so much ground that we decided to bring it to you in two parts. In this, the second half of our conversation, we explore how these two leaders see the West and how that worldview will reshape geopolitics. Orville, I want to talk more about the Cultural Revolution and the great tragedies of Mao's era. The question of why Xi Jinping treats that history the way he does still seems like kind of a puzzle to me, given his own personal experience. In power, he's tried to scrub that history and really gone out of his way to prevent criticism of Mao in that era. How does he see that history, and why does he feel the need to treat it the way he does?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that despite the fact that he comes from a family that was really laid low by the Maoist revolution and humiliated, that he still lionizes Mao. And I think here this gets back to this idea of the sort of yearning for a restoration of greatness. You know, the first thing Xi Jinping did when he came to power in 2012 was he took the entire Politburo across Tiananmen Square to an exhibit in the National Museum that was called China's Rejuvenation, as if to say, this is what I'm going to do for you. This is what we need. This is what we want. We need to be a great power. And this is my agenda. And actually, what he borrowed from Mao was the deep and abiding need for enemies. And that's the way he fuels this idea, I think, of rejuvenation. What I think he learned was you've got to keep be on your toes. You have to learn how to be brutal. You have to learn how to compete and struggle and win.
And if someone happened to remind him of the human costs of some of those, the results of those policies, is that the cost of progress or rejuvenation? How do you think he processes that?
I think he views the Chinese Communist Party as China's only saving grace. And if you lose the party, you know, as Steve said, you turn yourself into a Gorbachev show over. And so he staked his fortunes on the party, even though the party turned on his own family. And in a certain sense, you know, wreaked havoc on his family and on China.
Remember, Dan, the alternative to one-party dictatorship in their minds is not a liberal democracy. The alternative to a one-party dictatorship at home is chaos, anarchy, implosion, warlordism, right? It's collapse. And so for them, even though that instrument has been used in ways that maybe had negative effects from their point of view, it's still the instrument, not just for Xi Jinping's own personal power, but also for preventing the alternative in their minds. And that alternative is not what we would see potentially, or what some Chinese dissidents would see. It's an alternative that they fear. And to a certain extent, the rest of the population in both Russia and China share this view that as bad as one-party rule or dictatorship, in Putin's case, autocracy can be at times, that the alternative may be even worse rather than better. We probably need to understand that in their minds, that's the alternative that they need to hold at bay.
Steve, it's also a pathway to the restoration of greatness, which I think both Putin and Xi deeply yearn for.
Yeah, the state is their one instrument. They don't have the same type of dynamism in the open society and innovation society, and they don't have the friendships, the alliances across the globe that are voluntary. They don't have the instruments that we take for granted sometimes, and that we even sometimes try to undermine crazily. Their instrument is the state. The state is a coercive apparatus. Obedience or quasi-military style discipline in the political sphere, suppression of political alternatives, censorship, which means not just suppressing some views, but also promoting other views very widely so that people accept a certain set of information and ways of looking at the world. So they have this coercive state as their instrument. They lack some of the other instruments that we have. I should also add that, geography does play a role here. If you look at China, it has become a trading nation. It has followed in the footprint of the American-style modern power. It followed that because it has Japan across the water. Deng Xiaoping is looking at the Japanese ashes as a result of World War II, literally, and then within a generation and a half, second largest economy in the world. And how'd that happen? Well, it happened because they had access to the American domestic market and they manufactured things that American middle class wanted to buy. So Deng is looking at this right across the water. And he goes to Japan, by the way, before he comes to the United States, as Orville knows. But the limitations on this are severe. First of all, they have no California. Now, some people here paying taxes in California might rejoice at a statement like that. No California. But for China, that means that they don't have that gigantic Western Ocean opening up into a region that they can trade with across that body of water. Instead, for them, the West is desert, it's ethnic minorities that are under severe repression. And so they're trying to build an ersatz California through Pakistan and Burma. That's their way to get to the sea. But Pakistan and Burma, they don't own those places. Those places are volatile, and that's ultimately no substitute for the actual California. And then even if you look at the one coast China does have, their eastern coast, it's not exactly open to the ocean the same way that the U.S. eastern coast is with the Atlantic. As you know, Dan, it's closed in by what we call the first island chain, which is dotted with American military bases, and which has a lot of choke points that the Chinese are concerned about that could be closed down by the American Navy potentially, or coalition alliance navies. And so for them, even their one coast is not fully open the same way that a maritime power like Japan or Britain or, of course, the US would have. And so for them, they're trying to play this game partially with autocratic rule rather than limited government, with closed political system and closed society rather than a fully open one, with repression and censorship rather than with the chaos and the berserk quality of an open society that we have here in America. So they're doing the trade part. They're finally building the Navy, by the way, right? They built the Navy out. They did all this without a Navy. They used our Navy to become a trading nation. But there are limitations in China's ability because of its system and its geography, which are interlocked, for them to play this game of modern power as successful as we do. And so if you look, the U.S. flipped Germany and Japan into the American voluntary sphere of influence, and flipping Germany and Japan were decisive in that. And then following Germany and Japan, Eastern Europe came in 89, as you know, which has been transformative. The transatlantic piece has only grown, and the East Asian piece has also grown because of the successes of South Korea and Taiwan, not just economically, as we know, but also the transformation into rule of law, pluralistic, open society democracies. That's been astonishing. And so all of that happened in a recent time period, and China was great for millennia before that. But now they face the fact that U.S. power exists. So when they talk about the 18th century or the Tang Dynasty or whichever one of their great historical periods they want to talk about, there was no U.S. power then. And so it's just a different game for them to play. So rolling back American power, right? That 9-dash line in the South China Sea, that's no accident, right? They're hemmed in and they're trying to push out, trying to loosen the American alliance system and the American military bases along the first island chain. This is a intentional, clear as day, geopolitical strategy that they're unfolding. And we were naive about this, but it's rooted in the history and the geography, and they know that history and the geography, and we have to know it better. And so let's not allow them to flip Eastern Europe. Let's not allow them to flip Germany with economic ties. Let's not allow them to neutralize Japan. People speak about a multipolar world, and it just drives me insane. And they say, how could you be against the multipolar world, right? It's democratic, it's fair, and we all have to share the planet together. But then the poles are not the same. The U.S. pole is open, non-coercive, and voluntary for the most part. And people are asking to join, like Ukraine. The Chinese pole is coercive, vassalage, non-voluntary, and it's about subordination to China. You can ask Putin about this himself. And so when we speak about a multipolar world in a positive sense, we are doing China propaganda here because the poles are not equivalent.
Orville, if you put that narrative to Xi Jinping or Wang Yi or someone around him, what would their rejoinder be? What would their analysis be?
So, Dan, the question I would like to put to Wang Yi and Xi Jinping is this. I mean, Steve has just sort of laid it out for us. Why are you doing this? Why, when it's so demonstrably not in the interest of China, I should say also in Russia to invade Ukraine, why does China, when it had a really good thing going and had everybody eating out of their hands, why does it go and alienate Korea over THAAD? Who alienates Sweden? Or Norway, or India, one of the first non-aligned nations to recognize China, or even Australia. I mean, what's going on here is the question I would like to ask Xi. Why are you doing this? You had a really good thing going. You can have your little one-party state. Nobody was beating up on you. Just keep a little reform going, and we'll all share and care, and the global economy will go, and you'll get rich. And, when Mao Zedong met with Kissinger and Nixon, he said, Taiwan, settle it in 100 years, no problem. And Steve, you mentioned Deng Xiaoping stopping in Japan on his way to restore diplomatic relations with Jimmy Carter. He said in Japan, he said, Taiwan, let's leave it for smarter generations to come to solve. Now, why is not that a good formula?
You're absolutely right. China had its cake and it was eating it too.
Yeah. So that's the question I want an answer to.
I think it's fear. I think they understand at a fundamental level that our existence and our power and our open societies and our values and our alliances, even when we fail to live up to our promises fully, that it is an existential threat to their existence. And so it's not American policy. The issue is just our existence is existential for them. It's a bizarre situation where on the one hand, they're the principal beneficiaries, and on the other hand, there couldn't be a bigger threat than the international order that we created for them. And so maybe as Marxist-Leninists, they're not being fools, when they take those cricket bats across the border with India and smash the heads of India and push India into the American camp, as you alluded to. It looks crazy. It looks idiotic. It looks worse than idiotic. And yet maybe it's rooted in a cynical but profound understanding of the way they fit into the world going forward.
Well, this is exactly the understanding that I think we need to understand better. And it has two elements. One is China's sort of deep historical sense of grievance. And the other is, of course, what are the animating principles that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are guided by? In other words, what sets them off? Because in an autocracy, individual personalities of leaders get to write themselves very large. And I think there's some very mysterious questions that are very hard to answer. People always say to me, oh, don't talk about ideology. I think you're absolutely right that when you have two such antithetical political systems, they cannot help but feel competition, even threat from each other. And I think that is sort of the radioactive core that helps, make everything else so difficult to deal with now that Xi has really he's committed now to what he calls they have some words in Chinese that aren't quite the Chinese model. But there's no doubt about it. He thinks that the people's democratic dictatorship of the proletariat is a better form of democracy than what we have. And that is a source of immense contention and controversy between us.
We can say till we're blue in the face, we're not pro-regime change, we're not trying to contain China, but he's sure that the whole American establishment, that this is all we think about when we wake up in the morning.
Well, you'll remember that this all began with John Foster Dulles, when John Foster Dulles said, we may not be able to win China over militarily, but we will get them by peaceful evolution, by soft power and one thing or another. And so this word, peaceful evolution, which sounds pretty good to us, is a total antichrist in China, because it's the color revolution. It's the underhanded way that they feel they're going to be undermined by the ideological differences and the preferences that people feel for one system over another.
Steve, that ideological dimension in Putin's case seems a little bit harder to decipher. He invokes kind of cultural conservatism, and he obviously obsesses over color revolutions in the way that Orwell referred to, but it's a little less clear that he has some ideological commitment or a commitment to a kind of system that he thinks has broader relevance in the way that the Chinese Communist Party does.
Yeah, it's different for Russia, Dan, because Russia is culturally European. China is not culturally European and doesn't care. It doesn't care about ancient Rome or ancient Greece. It doesn't care about the Renaissance and the Reformation. It's China. It's got its own story, which in their minds is grander than Western civilization's story. Russia's different because it's clearly culturally European, right? It's not Western institutionally, because the West is not a geographic but an institutional matrix. Japan is not European culturally, but it's institutionally Western. Russia is not Western, but it's European. So for Russia, you have a kind of ceiling on the anti-Westernism. And so you can do anti-Westernism in Russia. It's mother's milk, and it's the way these regimes maintain their grip on society, their hold on power, and in Putin's case, the personal regime. But being completely cut off from Europe forever is a difficult proposition to sell in the case of Russia. And so we see now some rumblings about potential vassalage to China here. And of course, Russia doesn't decide to become a vassal of China. That's China's decision. If China makes Russia a vassal, it becomes partially responsible for Russia. So I'm not sure we're there yet on the China side. But on the Russia side, you see the disquiet about being in some type of partnership, however we want to call it, with China indefinitely and losing the ties to Europe. And so for Putin, he has the same ambivalence. I wouldn't say it's 50-50 ambivalence, but it has vacillated over time, where it's been more pro-Western integration, less anti-Westernism earlier, and far more anti-Western and less pro-Western integration now. To a certain extent, the 1990 attempt to integrate Russia into the West, which was sowed by illusions on both sides, it blew up. The attempt to integrate China into the West also blew up, but in very different ways, because China was never going to become culturally part of the West. It was always going to be, right, its own civilization in a deep and profound way. Russia was going to be its own civilization, but partially European, Western, to a degree that they were willing to explore. So for Putin and the rest, reaching for an ideology the anti-Westernism is what's on the shelf. But is it anti-Westernism or is it anti-Americanism? And this is true for China to a certain extent as well. Because you can be anti-American, but you can have very good relations with Europe. You can divide the West. You can cleave off, put a wedge in between Europe and the United States. The Ukraine war blows all this up. The biggest geopolitical consequence so far of the Ukraine war was the destruction of China's wedge in the Western alliance between the US and Europe on China policy and the US and Japan on China policy. We could throw in Australia here. We could throw in the Western Pacific. And so China has strategically inflicted so much damage by its support for Putin's aggression in Ukraine. And it's not clear he can recuperate this. It's not clear that even if there is some type of solution in Ukraine, and it's a solution where people stop dying. That's what I mean by a solution. Even if that happens, how will China be trusted again, given what it did with Putin over the Ukraine war? And so that strategic blunder or self-inflicted damage is, to me, potentially enduring. And so for Russia, it's already been a strategic defeat across the board. Sadly, Russia's strategic defeat is not a Ukrainian victory. But for China, it's also been a strategic defeat. And so how does he recuperate that? How does he get the wedge back in between America and Europe, between America and Japan? I'm not sure he does. And so, Putin is a hedge for him. If it wasn't for Russian fissile material, the stuff you make nuclear bombs with, and China's program to build out a massive nuclear arsenal, which we think could potentially rival the Russian one and the American one in the fullness of time. There's a dependence on Russia for a lot of that, especially the fissile material and expertise. If it weren't for that, the cost of the hedge would so far outweigh the benefits of the hedge, and you would see a lot more vulnerability to Xi Jinping domestically over his choices. You could see more grumbling going forward about this bromance, the strategic bromance, the strategic partnership. But if it keeps costing China as much as it does, and the Russian thing gets worse and worse, and China is partially responsible for that Russian basket case and has lost Europe and Japan permanently, I'm not sure. They already have so many domestic issues that we didn't talk about. One-man rule is susceptible to mistakes in a much bigger way than competitive rule, even competitive authoritarianism is. So it has been very interesting to watch Putin's miscalculation and Xi, as it were, doubling down with his own miscalculation on top of that, paying a different kind of price, right? The Ukrainians are paying the ultimate price here. Putin is paying a price, Russia's paying a price, and China is paying a price.
Orville, as we've watched Xi Jinping's relationship with Putin over the course of the last 18 months, his reaction to the war in Ukraine, he certainly seemed a little bit on his back feet right after the war started. Just a couple of weeks before that, they'd stood together in Beijing and talked about a partnership without limits between Russia and China. He does seem to have been a little bit more proactive in trying to navigate some of the dynamics that Steve laid out. What is your sense of how he sees this picture at this point? Do you think he sees a chance for advantage, or is that kind of grim strategic outcome that Steve described more or less inevitable?
I think he does feel a little bit betrayed and trapped, but he's not going to make any demonstrations of anti-Russian sentiment. I think the thing that really astounds me about both Xi Jinping and Putin is the lack of sense of agency that they have, that they seem to not understand that they are creating the very situation they most fear, and that the world is responding to them, not to nothing. They just think the world is this hostile place out here that likes to get together and have a Cold War 2.0. But, in actuality, both of these countries have a lot more power than I think Xi or Putin recognize. And it wouldn't be very difficult, particularly in Xi's case, to kind of, use that power in a different way and recognize that you do X, Y is going to happen. And if it's against your interest, then do something else. And it's very hard for them to give a little to get a little, because they don't really have a very highly evolved notion of the essentially reciprocal nature of foreign policy and great power relations.
But Orville, if you're sitting, and these are smart people sitting in Beijing, as they observe the Russian experience and what Vladimir Putin has done to his own country's strategic prospects, they must see warnings in that. They must see certain courses that they would want to avoid.
I mean, I think many do have a very highly evolved recognition of this. And I think Xi himself may even recognize it, but I think he's bereft of the ability to make that kind of critical. We thought of sort of flexible authoritarianism. And in a certain sense, that was true for a long time. It still remains to be true whether Putin can evince that kind of flexibility. And if it gets too brittle, of course, then it gets dangerous. Now, he did turn around on COVID, but I don't see a lot of flexibility in his playbook because I think he is so ginned up on his own big leader culture and his own fear of looking weak or surrendering. And he's so besotted with this notion of hostile foreign forces that it's very hard to make nice.
Dan, everyone says we got to share the world with China. We got to share the world with Russia, right? They're not going away. They were here before we were. They're going to be here in the future. We got to share the world. And I say, you're right. And you want to know something else? The ocean is wet. I know that firsthand. So the issue is not we got to share the world, Dan. The issue is what are the terms that we're going to share the world with? Are the terms going to be the 14 demands they tried to impose on Australia? Or what they did to Lotte World and South Korea over the missile defense system, or what they're doing with the cricket bats on the other side of the line that's in dispute with India, or we could go on, right? What they're doing in Xinjiang, what they did in Hong Kong. Are those the terms that we're going to share the world with them? Because if those are the terms, I want to push back. But at the same time, I recognize, like Orville does, that we're in this together. It's a planet. And it's the only one we've got, than all the other cliche. But so the Soviets shot down KAL, the Korean civilian airliner. They shot it down, and we had evidence that they shot it down in real time. And we exposed that evidence publicly. And George Shultz went to Moscow. He didn't cancel the trip. Forget about some stupid spy balloon. They shot down a civilian airliner, denied it. We proved they lied, and Schultz got on the plane anyway. And Schultz got off the plane and demanded an answer for what they did. So China sends a spy balloon over the U.S., and Blinken cancels. He should have taken that balloon, what was left of it, put it on his plane, went to Beijing, and said, here, you can have it back now, but this is what you did. You got to define the terms of engagement. You got to create leverage. You have to make them be ashamed of things they do. Not we're ashamed that we shot the balloon down and we can't release the report about what was in it. What would George Shultz have done with that balloon? He would have done just what I said. He would have put it on his plane. He would have never canceled the trip, and he would have demanded an answer. And then he would have continued with the diplomacy. He wouldn't have broken off talks. The whole point of diplomacy is not that you talk, it's that you create leverage, and then you use that leverage in conversation to try to make deals which support your interests. You have to make concessions. You don't get everything you want. Even with Gorbachev, Reagan didn't get every single thing he wanted. And yet, that's diplomacy. That's not getting on a plane and begging for a meeting or whatever else it might be, or canceling a trip when they do something that they should answer for, rather than we have to answer for it.
When you look at the diplomacy around the war in Ukraine, China has, I think, responding to some of the dynamics that Steve laid out around its relation with Europe especially, made a big show of sending peace envoys, supporting peace talks. Can you imagine Xi Jinping making a serious effort to end the war in Ukraine? Do you see any substance to this? Anything he will do to constrain Putin at any point?
You know, I'm not sure I see evidence that Xi Jinping has this ability to date. And yet, as you, I think, are suggesting, it would be a stunning achievement for him. And if he really did want to reassure the world of China's constructive role, he could do something. And in fact, there are many areas where he could do something. But I'm not sure, and this is why I think we were having this discussion, is what is preventing him from playing a more constructive role in the world and a less destructive role in the world? I mean, why the belligerence? Why the wolf warrior diplomacy? No one believes that he's earnest in question of bringing peace to the Ukraine, but he could be.
He's got a problem, Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Right? We see this, Orville, with North Korea.
Yeah.
China can't give up North Korea. If it gives up North Korea, it ends up with unification of the Korean Peninsula with the South, the same thing that happened in the German case, as the winner of the Korean War. And then a U.S. military base even closer to China's border than it is now. And so the North Koreans drive the Chinese up the wall, as you know. But they bite the bullet. We could end up with a giant North Korea here with Vladimir Putin. Let's remember, he goes to Beijing, the Olympics, big ceremony, bromance, partnership with no limits, and then he unleashes this crazy war almost the day he sets down back in Moscow, which upends China's strategic wedge with the Europeans. Then Xi Jinping makes a play and says, you know what? They're not going to use nuclear weapons. Remember that? Remember how China intervened to prevent the first use of nukes over this war and how that was supposedly a big diplomatic accomplishment for Xi? And how many days later does Putin announce that he's moving tactical nuclear weapons into Belarus? You know, so much for my friend and strategic partner. I've just semi-humiliated him in public by making this announcement over Belarus. So I don't know what these guys are talking about one-on-one, but I'm getting a sense, Orville, that the problem is less Xi Jinping here exerting his leverage than it is Putin. Let's remember that the Chinese didn't have much leverage when the war first broke out, largely because they haven't been supplying weapons to the Russians, which has been really important. At the same time, they've got leverage now that they didn't have before, because some very large percentage, perhaps as high as 70% of Russian chips, semiconductor chips, are coming from China now. They're not coming directly, they're going through Dubai and then through the Dubai port, overland through Iran and other ways, across the Caspian, etc. Our friends in Virginia understand this a lot better than I do, although I was in the Emirates recently to discuss these questions. In any case, they have some leverage now. And so those semiconductors, whatever level they're supplying, it's a very important level for Putin. And the Chinese, of course, could tilt the battlefield in Russians' favor because they have munitions, drones. They could supply Russia at scale. And they not only have stocks, they have production facilities at scale in China. And so they could increase their leverage. But what does he get if he gives up Putin? Is the U.S. going to repeal the CHIPS Act, Dan? If Xi Jinping cashiers his closest friend, what does he get for that from the U.S.? The entire U.S. full court press remains in place. There's no reciprocation for any potential abandonment of Putin. And so what Orville is referring to is correct, of course, that he's got the opportunity to bring peace to Europe and recuperate that relationship and reinsert the wedge between Europe and America if he brings peace to Europe, the great peacemaker of Europe. But to do that, he's got to put the screws on Vladimir Putin and bring Putin to heel. I don't know if he's tried yet. When he went to Moscow, if they discussed this, what would be acceptable to you, Vladimir, as an outcome if we interceded here? But this is what I do know. If Putin signs a piece of paper, it's worth nothing. His promises are worth nothing. Unless he signs the piece of paper in Beijing. And then all of a sudden, that piece of paper becomes meaningful. So China being involved in the negotiations, like Orville just alluded to, that it is a possibility for Xi Jinping to seize this. Ironically, we're self-interested in that, which is one of the reasons why President Zelensky of Ukraine has been a lot less dismissive of China's involvement here than we have been, although I think we've turned the corner a little bit and become less dismissive of potential Chinese involvement. At least that's my impression from some conversations on the inside and some public statements. How do you then go forward? What does the relationship then look like? What are the terms of sharing the planet? The engagement thing could never work because both sides had illusions, and a policy based on illusions is destined to fail. We had the illusion that they were going to liberalize politically, and they had the illusion that we were going down, whether it was the Iraq war, the global financial crisis, or COVID, or whatever, right? So we've both sowed illusions, and our illusions have, to a very great extent, been shaken, right? You can't be disillusioned, Dan, unless you had illusions. So that's a much better basis for a relationship now, when you have a more realistic picture of who the other side is and what their goals are and what their bottom line is and what their strengths as well as their weaknesses might be. But I just want to say that the puncturing of the illusions is a positive for me. Engagement blowing up and Xi Jinping rediscovering through this Ukraine war that the West is for real, those are really positive steps now that need to be consolidated with effective diplomacy and with creating leverage and using that leverage and all the other things, alliance system and that we've been talking about. So ironically, I'm actually more positive about U.S.-China relations now than I was during the heyday of engagement.
Orville, as you look at both the potential for the U.S.-China relationship, but also the interest that we, the United States, have of preventing a full, Sino-Russian alliance, full Sino-Russian convergence, what, as you look at our forward-looking options, would you be pointing policymakers towards in the next several years? Say?
Well, I think both Putin and Xi recognize that if the world is decoupling, and I think it is, maybe not completely, but that's the trend line, they really only have each other. I mean, Iran, a few other bits and pieces, maybe Pakistan or Hungary, doesn't quite do it for an alliance. And China still does have some real cards to play, but they need some other big substantial power if we're going to be off in a new kind of a version of whatever you want to call it, a Cold War. So I don't think that they're going to be able to push each other hard enough to actually lead. Interesting, you're optimistic, Steve, but your optimism, I think, is born out of a world of logic and reason. You can see that it would be in the interests of nations to do things. But I'm very interested in the psychology of these guys, because I think that's running them as much as a realistic assessment of interest. And this is what really frightens me, because I think they have very thin skin. I think they're very allergic to humiliation, very allergic to being shut out, disesteemed, all the things we've talked about. And I don't know what the remedy is for that.
Yeah, leadership variable, you're right, Orville. You can lay out the structural landscape, and then you need the leadership to kick in. And that's where the personalities, they impinge all up and down the whole story. He's got some very clever people in his regime. Wang Yi he's shrewd.
And we should say this is Xi Jinping's top foreign policy hand at this point.
He's no fool.
But I don't think he has permission to actually think really innovatively and creatively.
Yeah, the issue here is what you said, or it's reciprocity, right? So we felt that the Chinese didn't reciprocate to us. That's one of the reasons we're angry. We gave them WTO admission, and they failed to reciprocate. They failed to do some of the reforms that they should have done in order to qualify to get into WTO in the first place. So now if Xi Jinping makes some concessions, if he says, we got to walk this back, there's no sense of reciprocation on the American side. We now have a bipartisan commitment to standing up to China. And so if Xi Jinping gets the advice from Wang Yi or others that there needs to be some level of rapprochement, and for that, the Chinese have to take some steps here. Whatever those steps might be, we could argue and discuss, but there needs to be some level of movement in the Western, especially U.S. direction. Does the U.S. reciprocate, or does it, sort of smack the hand that reaches out? We understand that the Biden administration is trying. We see Jake Sullivan, we see Janet Yellen, now we see Anthony Blinken. We see all their main actors in the various pieces of our fragmented U.S. power. We see them reaching out to try to reestablish. The most prominent one is the Pentagon, of course, because they want to deconflict with hotlines and regular communication and all the things we had eventually with the Soviets. But is that really reciprocation, that kind of dialogue? Because yes, you want to talk, but what do you want to talk about? You want to talk about things that we don't want to talk about with you. You want to contain us. You want to hold us back. You want to put these guardrails. Well, within those guardrails, you're going to full court press us. So why should we allow you to have guardrails? That's just conceding the terms of your policy, of your posture, of your Cold War, or whatever we want to call it. So there's a fundamental problem of the absence of potential reciprocation on the U.S. side, even if the Chinese logically figure out what it is that we're talking about here that could alleviate the pressure on them that Orville has rightly said they've brought about on themselves to a very great extent. But I wonder if some catalyst moves, some series of events, some random actions, something that we're not predicting, moves us to a point where we can then take advantage of the catalyst, of the unforeseen events, of the contingencies that pop up. Are we ready to do that on each side? Because right now we're stuck in this doom loop that Orville has elucidated, which has this deep psychological dimension.
One, it's a strange thing to say, because to call it hopeful when it would also be a kind of a catastrophe. One thing that could actually help is if there is a real economic downturn, either in China or the globe, because those kinds of things remind people of interdependence and the need for interaction and some kind of keeping the fabric together. Short of something like that, I just don't see how we're going to get out of this rut to a place where we have a quid pro quo. If I was Biden and Xi, I would have a phone call and say, listen, each of us sends 3 people who are out of the government, who are smart as hell. Let's lock them in a room in Singapore for a week, see what they can come up with by the way of a quid pro quo, a roadmap that you're alluding to, Steve, and then let's you and I get together and see if there's anything we can agree on here. But short of that, I don't think we've got much to work with.
Yeah, well, we're not rolling back AUKUS.
No.
We're not rolling back the alliances. It's not as if we're going to say, oh, okay, the hell with our alliance with South Korea or Japan, or we're not going to give up those base rights, the access rights in the Philippines. There's just a whole lot of stuff we're not going to concede that's built in, that's baked in to whatever dialogue might be possible. And so the issue then becomes, what are the questions that could spark mutual interest? It used to be thought that we would have climate change or, fill in the blank, that there were a series of interests that they just had to be interested in because it was good for them and we had to be interested in. But the Chinese decided that they would not divide issues to ones we can't agree on and ones we can agree on and proceed with the ones we can agree on. They decided that it was all or nothing, right? Either we were going to walk, it was a whole package. You wanted to talk about climate? Well, we want to talk about your bases and your tech export controls and everything. So for me then, Orville, I don't know if this is fantasy on my part or an insight or neither. But the issue is, how do we get a concession where they're willing to divide some issues, so that some issues are worthy of dialogue from their point of view, even if other issues can't be talked about, let alone resolved.
And this is ironically what we had with the Soviet Union. Were able to talk about certain issues.
But the Chinese know that history too, once again, and they're afraid of that history. The reason the Chinese detest the idea of a Cold War, there are many reasons. One reason is they don't want to be the Soviet Union, right? That's not a good place for them to be. The idea that there's going to be a Cold War and the U.S. is going to play the U.S. again in the movie. Well, Orville, who's going to play the Soviets? The Chinese don't want to play the Soviets in that. And this separation of issues, where some issues are worthy of conversation while others are not going to be resolved. If we could get to that through a crisis, I hope not the kind of crisis you discussed, but some crisis whose consequences were less severe, and we could seize that as an opportunity and get to the point where we could have some issues where there's recognized mutual interest and where each side would have to make some concessions to make it work. And then we would have an actual dialogue that could expand and contract over time.
Before we put the two of you on a plane to Singapore to huddle with some Chinese counterparts along the lines Orville suggested, let me close by getting each of you to just briefly give some consideration to what happens after these two, enormous figures are no longer dominating their own countries and political systems in the way they are. Do you see the changes they have made to their systems as irreversible? Is this something that will continue to shape? Will we see the kind of system we've seen under these figures persist under different leadership after them? What does this look like after they leave the scene? Steve, let me start with you on Putin.
Everybody dies. Cemeteries are full of indispensable men, right, as the cliche has it. Stalin died and Mao died. But then, Dan, here we are. Stalin died and Mao died. And we're having a conversation, Dan, that we could have had back in the day about what happens after Stalin dies and what happens after Mao dies. So that's not encouraging. For Russia, it's pretty clear. They become like France, or it's trouble as far as the eye can see. France, which has a bureaucratic absolutist tradition, like Russia. France, which has a convoluted, complex, revolutionary tradition, like Russia. France, which threatened all its neighbors for a long time, but which doesn't threaten its neighbors anymore, and is just a proud state that sees itself as a civilizational state, but is integrated into global structures, is a positive actor, and is not threatening its neighbors, right? If Russia ends up looking like that, it would be fabulous, not just for the world, but for Russians. We thought we were on that trajectory in the 90s, and of course we weren't. What could trigger that trajectory, how we could get there, we don't have time to run through the scenarios, but you can see that where Russia is now and what France looks like now, that there's a bit of space between them, and that's a lot of territory to cross to get to that. Otherwise, we could end up with a gigantic version of North Korea. That's unfortunately the trajectory we're on now, or even worse than that. We could have a Chinese puppet regime in Moscow. We could have disintegration, chaos, warlordism, God forbid, in Moscow. We could have another authoritarian leader who at least recognizes the independent existence of Ukraine, might be xenophobic, might be aggressive, but may conclude that the Ukraine aggression was a mistake. That would be the best possible outcome. Certainly in the short term, it wouldn't solve the problem of Russia, but it would help solve the problem of Ukraine suffering. But Dan, I'm not that good at predicting the future. Otherwise, I would probably be in your chair rather than in my chair where I study history.
Orville, how about China after Xi Jinping?
Well, Xi Jinping too will pass. And I think it's important to remember as we contemplate that eventuality, both in Russia and China's case, but particularly in China's case, this country and societies, one of the least resolved societies that I'm acquainted with. And what I mean by that is there are a lot of conflicting forces, historically speaking, which lie beneath the surface. And different times, different mixes of these forces express themselves. So there is a kind of a more open, democratic, cosmopolitan, sophisticated, global side of China. And I think with Xi Jinping's passage, it could give an opportunity for that side. I mean, my God, there's so many smart Chinese scientists and writers. I mean, this is not a country filled with idiots, but it's a question of leadership and who allows whom to write themselves a little larger in society. So I think China has a lot of potential, but I just think we're stuck with a rather retrograde leader that until he either wakes up or moves on, it's hard to see a change coming. And I may be surprised, but changes are incipient within China, and there's potential for it to go in any number of directions, and we've never predicted one